Hi, and welcome back. Last time we learned to assess our space and create a plan. In our large lot garden, we developed a formal plan. This is a great way to design changes over a long period of time. Now, not everybody likes to work that way, so we'll discuss on-the-fly planning. Then, we'll head over to the garden center to get tips on selecting the plants. Our large lot had much more space to work with. The small townhouse, however, has limited space. Now we'll apply the same principles, but the design choices may be different. So large or small, we may have some of the same challenges. We may use the same solutions or look for something different. So let's go to our small space garden now and get started. We're at our urban test gardens, and the first thing we need to do before we do any landscape renovation is assess. And we need to take a look at what we want to keep and what we need to remove. And the first thing that catches my eye is the hose reel, right in your face, right at the entrance to the garage. We need to develop a focal point that really detracts your eye from that hose reel, but yet leaves it accessible. It's real important because that's the last view the homeowner has before she pulls into the garage. In addition, we have these wonderful plants, relatively new, but doing great because the soil was properly prepared. This climbing hydrangea has lightly fragrant flowers in late spring, and this foliage will eventually cover the brick, making it a nice backdrop for a focal point. The viburnum, it's a Korean spice viburnum, has wonderful fragrant flowers in the spring, nice fall color. It just needs a little bit of pruning to fit better into this space. You'll notice the strawberries are really taking off and starting to crowd out the annual snapdragons. Not a problem, because they were really added to add some color, but temporarily fill between the perennial strawberries. The other added benefit of the strawberries, as they grow, they'll cover the declining foliage of the bulbs. We need to leave those leaves intact so they put energy back into the bulb for next year's bloom. So a double benefit from that. Now let's take a walk to the curb and check out that garden. This may be a scene that you recognize from your front yard, perhaps a neighbor's, or somewhere else in your neighborhood. Street trees with plants struggling beneath. One of the problems is a lack of light, but the other problem is a lack of moisture. You see, the dense canopy of many street trees not only blocks the sunlight from reaching the plants below, but also stops the rainfall from reaching the ground. And what little moisture does penetrate that dense canopy, the tree takes up before the plants can. Thus, the plants struggle. Now, the homeowner had the right idea, looking for shade-tolerant plants for this area. The problem was, however, as the sun set, that western sunlight reflected off the drive and the walks, and it really heated up that planting bed and caused scorch on the hostas and ferns. So we're going to find some new plants for this area that tolerate shade, late afternoon sun, and the drier conditions. It took a couple months, but the homeowner found the perfect bench for this front entrance. Now, the plantings nearby are doing quite well, but they're not in quite the right place. So what we're going to do is move them so we can put planters on either side. We'll repeat some of the plants from under the tree into these containers, the hanging baskets, and on the front steps. It'll create a nice unified, spectacular front entrance. Now let's take a look at the other side yard. We've got another situation where we thought we had the right plant, but not quite in the right place. Russian sage would have been a great vertical accent here. Unfortunately, as the trees grew, they shaded out the plant. We're going to move this to a sunnier spot, perhaps in a container, and look for maybe a deciduous, tall, narrow shrub to fill this space. Our coneflowers are doing pretty good, but there are a few that are really suffering. So what we're going to do is remove the mulch, add about 1 inch of compost. Research found that if you top dress your bed with 1 inch of compost every other year, your perennials get most of the nutrients they need. Plus, the microorganisms move that organic matter into the root zone and improve your plant health. We also have this lonely snapdragon. It's doing well, but it's really out of place. So we're going to find it a better home in this landscape so it won't look so lonely. Now let's take a walk around back and assess that area. I've asked the homeowner to meet me in her patio garden. She already knows some of the problems she has, and I'll be able to identify others. You may have some of the same issues. We're looking at this miscanthus. It's really overgrown. It was beautiful before the gardens filled in, but now it's too much as the perennials have filled in around it. So we're going to move them to our large space garden. We brought in some experienced helpers from the Leesburg Master Gardening Group. They're going to dig out the plants we've identified as out of place or not doing well. We'll move them or pot them up depending on what we've decided. Here are some things we're going to do. Move the Siberian iris to a pot and some on the other side to give more unity to the planting. Pot the mums in a container because they're too crowded. We're adding a couple new, smaller grasses, prairie dropseed and Shenandoah switchgrass. We'll move out the pinks, you may know as dianthus, as much as we like them, and maybe put in a Roseanne geranium. They'll knock your socks off. We'll add more of the Cimicifuga and take out some of the ostrich fern. And we'll get more Japanese painted fern because these guys are doing well. We'll pot up the Russian sage, and while we move all these plants, we'll be careful to cover the roots when we dig them out so they don't dry out or get exposed to air too long. You'll notice we've got a great trick for moving the plants. We're wrapping the roots in wet newspaper or placing them in plastic grocery bags, and that makes it very easy to move them and reduces the stress on the plants. We'll amend the soil where we've got bad conditions, and we'll come back in session 4 to see how things look with some of our plants in place. We've gotten a good look at both of our test gardens, the one out in the country or a more suburban area and this small urban space. I've decided to do a more formal design for that larger garden and landscape area, but in this smaller space, I thought I'd just sketch down a few ideas. And you may want to do the same, a little more informal approach of getting your ideas in place. But before you start picking your plants, you may want to look a bit more at the soil, moisture, and other items that need to be considered before you design. So we're going to go back into my design studio and talk about the science behind landscaping. Our urban test garden has a lot of challenges because it's got sun, shade, half shade, as well as different moisture conditions. You probably have a few of these challenges in your own landscape. Now these influence plant selection because we want to match the plant to the growing conditions. The palette of plants suited to these growing conditions, light in this case, further influences our design since shade and sun plants vary in their looks. Shade plants like this philodendron typically have large, thinner leaves, lots of surface area for capturing the light, as much light as possible. The bold texture is really an attention getter and creates a focal point. Sun plants, on the other hand, tend to have smaller leaves, much like this jade plant, less surface area because there's plenty of light available. They also have thick leaves like this jade and other succulents, and some may even have hairs like the old man cactus to shade the plant, reducing the light reaching that plant. They often have finer texture, thinner leaves like grass or spines like the cactus, and that finer texture needs to be compensated with many plants to counteract the bold leaves of the philodendron. But the good news is fine texture can help give you a sense of depth in your garden. Now, some of the things are very obvious, as we mentioned, thickness of leaves. Also lobing. Sun-loving plants tend to have a lot of lobe leaves, less surface area needed than the bigger leaves of our shade plants. Sun plants also tend to have a thicker cuticle or waxy covering that helps conserve moisture. Hairs, as we mentioned, and those pores that exchange gas from the plant, you have more of them in a sun lover because you have smaller area for those stomata or pores to occur. So those are some of the hidden things, just like the cells inside the leaf line up differently. More vertical in sun lovers because you need less surface area. Flatter in shade lovers. So some of the differences are obvious and affect our design, and some of them are inside and affect the operation and how the plants grow and flourish. Making that transition between sun and shade areas in the landscape can be challenging from a design standpoint, since you often have plants that look so different, especially in extremely different light conditions. Now, to make this transition work, we're going to try a repetition of texture, color, and form. Texture, We're going to look for bold plants in the sun that mimic those bold plants in the shade. For example, ornamental rhubarb and colewort in the sun echo the large leaves of hosta, rhodgerssia, ligularia, philodendron, and fatsia in the shade. Repetition of form using, say, upright plants like sedges in the shade that mimic the upright growth of ornamental grasses in the sun. The fine texture we see on ferns, now though there are many little leaflets, there's a lot of leaf surface, but their fine textured ferns can be mimicked by the fine texture of the narrow leaves of yarrow. Annual vinca is a sun-tolerant plant that looks much like the shade-tolerant impatient. We'll also use a repetition of color. This can help by doing color echoing, using one color repeated throughout the landscape on different plants or parts of plants. For example, we may use a red leaf coleus in the shade and repeat that red on a sun-loving pentas. Shade-tolerant plants are smaller in number, fewer to choose from usually. So here are some shade-tolerant plants you may recognize. Some of the annuals that are very commonly used in shade include impatiens, probably the most or one of the most popular bedding plants because it blooms almost nonstop throughout the growing season. Coleus, a great shade plant, though there are also some sun-loving cultivars out there, add color with their leaves. Begonias come as wax begonia, tuberous, and cane begonias and are great in containers or right in the garden. The wishbone flower is often overlooked, known as Torrenia, and if you take a close look at its reproductive part, the stamens, they look just like a wishbone. Now, some of the shade perennials that you may recognize are hostas with their bold leaves that can be green, kind of a bluish green or variegated. Ferns with their fine leaflets that add a nice light airy texture to the garden. Hellebores that can bloom in winter, spring, and really add a lot of interest year-round because in some parts of the world they're evergreen. Siberian bugloss or brunera is a wonderful plant because it has blue flowers like forget-me-nots in the spring, heart-shaped leaves that can be green or variegated, and really good shade tolerance. Canadian ginger will die back in the winter, but its leaves are wonderful throughout the growing season and great shade plants. And of course, those big, bold leaves of fatsias, some of us grow as indoor plants, are great in the more tropical regions. Shade trees and shrubs are also available, fewer in numbers, but things like dogwood, depending on where you live, many have beautiful spring flowers, fruit that the birds love, and interesting bark. Hydrangeas are a popular shade-tolerant shrub, the big white flowers of the hills of snow hydrangea, or the pink and blue ones that we often see that add a lot of color to the spring landscape, or the oak leaf hydrangea with its beautiful exfoliating orange bark, pretty flowers, and excellent fall color. Viburnums come in a wide variety of plants, some with very fragrant flowers, many with berries that the birds love, most of them with great fall color, and some are even evergreen, depending on where you live. Musselwood is an understory tree with smooth gray bark that really adds appeal to the landscape year-round. And boxwood is a broadleaf evergreen grown throughout much of the world that adds greenery year-round to any landscape. Now, of course, our choices are going to vary depending on where you live. Matching plants to the light is a good idea. Not only will you have a better looking and healthier garden, but it means less work for you. Now, when you talk to gardeners, you'll get lots of different definitions to what light really means, full sun versus shade. And shade is not created equal. I kind of like to use this definition. Full sun, 8 hours or more of sunlight. You may hear some experts say 6 hours. But I know we gardeners like to push the limits, so if I tell you 8, it gives you a little wiggle room. Part sun is 4 to 6 hours of sun, maybe a little bit sunnier than partial shade, which is still about 4 to 6 hours of sun, but just a little less so. Dappled shade means you get intermittent sun all day or bright indirect light. Those of you struggling with dense shade have no direct sun at all, really limiting your plant choices. Keep in mind that sun and shade patterns are ever changing, so you're going to need to keep evaluating that at different times of the day, throughout the year, and over time. As the sun travels over your landscape, the plants and buildings, the position of the sun may change. That will impact the light reaching individual plants. From season to season, your trees may or may not have leaves, and that too influences the amount of light reaching the plants below. The position of the sun in the sky throughout the year changes the amount of light reaching your plants. And over time, trees grow, buildings are added or removed, and those structures and those growing trees can reduce the amount of light or increase the amount of light, if the buildings are removed, that reach your plants and impact how they grow. So now that we understand the impact that we see on the plants, let's look at a bit of the science behind it. Photosynthesis is about the inputs and the outputs when it comes to creating energy. The raw ingredients involved that you may remember from high school biology and science, we have carbon dioxide and water that are converted to glucose, energy for the plants, with the help of the sunlight, and the output is oxygen and water. Now, if we have less sun, that means less energy and less photosynthesis occurs. And that means we need fewer resources for our plants. One of the common mistakes that I often see is that gardeners try to overcompensate for a lack of light with more water and more fertilizer. Now, if you think about it, plants growing in shade need less of both. They're growing slower, so they're going to need less energy, and that means less inputs. Plants suffering from low light situations can show some outward symptoms that we can see. Let me show you a few examples. A common symptom of plants that are lacking sufficient sunlight are long and leggy stems. This cilantro that was growing in a window in a northern garden during the winter is a prime example. Notice leggy stems and petioles and very few leaves. More sunlight would definitely help this one. And some plants may have stunted leaves because of the stress and less light than needed. Or in the case of this pepper, you may have pale leaves and less vigorous growth. And you may find that some plants are more susceptible to diseases like powdery mildew when they're grown in shady conditions. Now, on the other hand, plants that are suffering from too much light will be sunburned. This happens when we move shade plants into full sun. Hostas are a great example. The leaf edges may brown, you may have some brown burned spots on the leaf or bleached out spots. This also happens when we move house plants or transplants from inside to the outdoors. Think of it like tanning yourself after a long winter and going down south to a warm sunny spot, or in the spring when you're out in your garden, you spend the day in the sunlight, and at the end of that day, your skin is bright red. The same thing happens to those plants. We can help plants adjust to their environment when we make some of these drastic changes. It's called acclimatization or hardening off. It's gradually helping those plants convert from the sun and shade conditions to the reverse. That change happens internally as well. Cells realign, the leaf size may change, and in some cases, the plants may actually drop their leaves and put out new leaves more adapted to the environment. Light has other impacts on plants and their growth. Let's look at vegetables and the impact of light intensity. Leafy plants are more shade tolerant. Things like Swiss chard and lettuce can get by with a lot less light than those that we eat the flowers and fruit, like tomatoes, broccoli, and squash. They need more light. More energy is needed since flowers and fruit require a lot of energy. Their energy sinks. And more sun means greater photosynthetic capacity, and that means more energy, and that's why we need that full sun for those plants. Day length or duration, the length of light and dark period of light, also influences the plants we grow indoors and out. Longer days mean greater photosynthesis, and that means we can have other things happening. 14 to 16 hours, that's about the max you need when you're using artificial light growing plants indoors. But day length can also impact flowering. That's known as photoperiodism. Poinsettias are a great example. They set their flowers with 14 hours of uninterrupted dark period, short days, long nights to initiate those flowers. Mums are a good garden and florist example. The mums we get from the florist typically set their flowers under long, dark periods and short days. The garden mums are the same type of mum, typically just different varieties, but those that set their flower under longer days than the florist mums. If we use a florist mum outside, Depending on where you live, the snow may be flying before you get blooms. So that's why we want to select carefully. Light is just one factor to consider when you're evaluating your landscape, designing changes, and purchasing new plants. You also need to know if the plant will tolerate the extreme heat and cold of your area. Use cold and heat hardiness maps to help you with this. They're available online, in catalogs, and from knowledgeable garden center staff. Now, when you're looking at the hardiness map, you want to first look at it overall and identify your hardiness zone. I basically garden in the Midwest, and we're gardening here in the Northeast, so we've kind of found our hardiness zone. My home zone is zone 5. Now, that kind of gives me a general idea of the average cold winter temperature and degree days over 85 in the summer when I'm selecting plants. But there's a lot of differences within that region and within the community. For example, I live near a large lake. If at one point I worked in a community all about 5 miles away from the lake, and our botanical gardens was about 5 miles southwest of that. And our first killing frost in the fall always arrived first at the place I worked, in the low area with the demonstration gardens. The botanic garden got hit next, and then I was the last one to lose my garden because of the impact of not only the lake, but the urban heat island near my home. So I got a little bit longer growing season in the fall, but a cooler start in spring. You also want to take a look at those microclimates in your own backyard, those areas that may be a little protected. For example, in my Zone 5 area, I found one gardener with a very protected backyard that was able to grow Bing cherries, something that shouldn't happen in that area. I also have found situations with smaller plants like bulbs. Daffodils, for example, I planted against my neighbor's home. That heat radiating from the house, that very protected spot, I found those daffodils sprouted early in the spring. That was great when we didn't have a late spring frost, but those years when the spring frost arrived a little later, it often killed the bloom. I was willing to take that chance for a little more extended bloom time by adjusting the microclimate. So try placing your plants where you can take advantage of those heat islands within your backyard or those cooler spots for those cool weather plants. You also need to know about the length of your growing season, those number of frost-free days. This determines what annual plants will reach maturity and flower or fruit during the growing season. And knowing the average last spring frost and the first fall frost will help you properly plan planting and harvesting. And selecting the right plant will not only save you time and money, but also effort planting and the effort needed to replace plants that weren't suited to your climate. Now, a label is a great place to gather much of the information you need. Let's take a look at the label that I have right here, and we'll walk through some of the things. You notice this one has a picture on the label, a great way to show you what you're going to get over time. When we turn the label over, there's some really valuable information. And here we've got light information. The ultimate size, that's great for planning your garden. So you know how big that plant, about how big it will grow. Now keep in mind, the growing conditions in your backyard will influence the mature size. Here we've got hardiness. This is based on the USDA in this case, and it tells us where this plant will grow given the minimum winter temperatures in those zones. Additional information like fertilization, watering, and care. And on this particular label, we've got planting guidelines just to make sure you get the plant in the ground correctly. Now, many labels will have both the common and botanical name. And you notice it's down here. That's really important because it ensures you're getting the right plant. Now, for example, pansies have over 500 common names. Now, it's probably not a big issue with pansies and other annuals like marigolds and zinnias, but it can be an issue for trees, shrubs, and even perennials. So let's take a trip to Meadow Farms Garden Center, and I'll show you what I mean. I've often heard this one called red maple, but it's truly a Norway maple. As you can see, the leaves come out a purpley red on this variety, Crimson King, and stay that way all season long. It's a tough urban tree tolerant of pollution and heavy soils, often used as a street tree, but it does produce lots of seeds and weed problems for many. Let's look at a couple more of the red maples. These next two red maples are actually Japanese maples, but they're different cultivars. You can see their leaves are a little different in their growth habit. Now, at first glance, you might think they're going to be the same size, but this one is going to reach about 20 feet tall and grow upright. The one on my left is going to be wide and spreading, about 6 to 7 feet tall and even wider. So you want to make sure you get the right cultivar variety of Japanese maple. Plus, both of these require moist, well-drained soils, little shelter from the afternoon sun, and protection from the cold winter temperatures in northern regions. So we're going to need to select carefully. Now let's take a look at the true red maple. Here's the true red maple, Acer rubrum. As you can see, the leaves come out green and they're a beautiful red in the fall. Plus it has nice smooth gray bark. It's a great medium-sized shade tree, but it does require acidic soil. So if you don't have acid soil, I have a hybrid maple just for you. This is a hybrid maple, and a hybrid is when two plants are crossed to create something new. In this case, the red maple, Acer rubrum, was crossed with the silver maple, Acer saccharinum. This happens in nature, but it can also happen when horticulturists and plant propagators get involved. We have the beautiful red fall color of the red maple in this Acer X Fremanii, and we also have the fast growth and alkaline soil tolerance of the silver maple. Best traits of two put together for you to enjoy. Now, this is a good example of knowing the botanical name can help make sure you get the right plant for the right place. Let's go back to the garden center and get busy picking our plants for our design. So bring your plant list and designs along with you to the garden center, whether you've got a formal design or a casual plan. Remember to check the labels for climate and soil conditions as you do your shopping. You don't want to put something in your garden that needs a lot of water next to something that likes it dry. And you may find that you change your mind about the design once you know a little bit more about the plants and as you explore the garden center. Now, I tried out our designs at the garden center, and you'll want to do the same thing. But if you're new to gardening, you may be overwhelmed when you walk into the entrance of that garden center. So here are a couple things to keep in mind. Come prepared. Have your list in hand. Have your plan if available. Especially during the busy season, that will help garden staff be efficient with their time and more helpful to you. Annuals are typically grouped together and often by light needs. Sun-loving annuals together with shade-loving annuals together in another spot, moisture-loving, often they make the job easier. Perennials may be displayed in alphabetical order or by growing conditions. It depends on the garden center. Trees and shrubs are usually off a little bit with a little more space to grow, and so you may want to explore a little before you flag down some staff to help you. And a lot of the garden centers have tags or labels that will help you find the plants you're looking for. Specialty plants may be inside if they're tropical and need warmed conditions and it's a chilly spring. Water plants will be in an area displayed maybe with fish and other water features. So do a little exploration in your homework and it'll be a much more satisfying experience and you'll want to come back many more times. Now, one of the things that I like to do when I'm shopping and checking out my design is use the cart method. I grab a cart or two or sometimes three and start gathering plants. I'll set the plants destined for a garden together on one cart. I kind of arrange them just like I would in the garden. It gives me an idea if the textures and colors go together. I double check the label to make sure that the sizes are right and the spacing will be correct. I also do a double check to make sure those plants require the same growing conditions. It's just one last check on my work I did back in the garden studio, back on my kitchen table where I like to do my planning. You'll make those needed adjustments in your design and will continue to do this throughout the process until we're ready to plant. It's time to wrap up this session. So throughout the process, relax and take a break. Go visit other gardens, both public and private. Then take a walk through the neighborhood. Both professional and avid gardeners are always happy to share ideas, so ask. You may even end up with a few free plants. In our next session, we're going to start our third stage. love the look and smell of healthy soils. Gardeners will tell you it's the foundation for a great garden, and it's also the reservoir for water, nutrients, and air. You might call nutrients the food that plants need to grow. We get hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, as well as the mineral matter found in soil and organic matter. Though all the nutrients are important, the big three are nitrogen, good for leaf and stem growth; phosphorus, good for flowering, fruiting, and root development; potassium, good for disease resistance and hardiness. Now, the real challenge is creating the perfect mix, because every successful gardener will tell you it's all about the soil. So we're going to head into the garden studio to take a closer look. As we discussed last time in the studio, plants need sufficient light to grow.